Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and belated Eid Mubarak. It's great to be with you here today. I'm speaking from the United States. I live in the state of Michigan, and for the last several weeks, I've been talking and touring my new book, which Nida has just mentioned, The New Crusades, which addresses Islamophobia on a global scale. This is the book. I'm not sure, inshallah, it makes your way to India so that you guys can all read the book, but I'll talk briefly about the book. I'll address how the book is germane to what's taking place in India right now, with obviously the rise and the violent sort of expansion of Hindutva supremacy in your country. And I'm really excited to hear from your insights and hopefully engage in a Q&A after some brief remarks that I'll make. I'll be really brief because I'm more interested in the exchange, because I want to learn from you guys as well, and learn directly about what it is you're experiencing on the ground in real time in India. I'm obviously here in the United States, and I've learned immensely from many of the Indian Muslim and also non-Muslim activists and advocates on the ground in India over the course of the last 9 years since Modi came to power in 2014, and then we've seen Islamophobia skyrocket and swell very intensely in your country. But very briefly, I'll talk about the book, and I'll talk about why the book is important to what's taking place in India. We all know that this war on terror began 22 years ago now in the United States after these 9/11 terror attacks. Then President Bush, many of you guys are young and you don't remember this by memory, you might have read this, but President Bush of the United States launched a global war on terror weeks after the 9/11 terror attacks, where his presidential administration essentially, forced countries around the world to either be with us or against us. This was an ultimatum that came from the highest rungs of presidential power here in the United States. And so we saw, with the consequence of this war on terror, which became global, that the language of counterterrorism, this conflation of Muslim identity with terrorism, the idea that expressions of Muslim identity were tied to, ideations like extremism, radicalization, the idea that Muslim identity could not be assimilated within Western democracies, but also Eastern democracies, or quote unquote democracies like India, was becoming expanded and exported on a global scale. So the reason why Islamophobia has become a global phenomenon, for those of you who follow me on social media, you might know that I recently talk about how Islamophobia is a global phenomenon that is exported and advanced by the United States as the principal conductor of the war on terror, is because it was the American government, first the Bush administration, followed by the Obama administration, and then most explicitly the Trump administration, which began to globalize the idea that expressions of Muslim identity, that the idea that Muslims who were, freely exercising their faith, engaging in traditions like Ramadan, convening in community for events like Iftar, Edan playing publicly, Muslim women and girls wearing the hijab, that these expressions of Muslim identity in some respects signaled the prospect or a propensity for terrorism. And we saw governments around the world, right, adopt this American conflation of Muslim identity with terrorism as a consequence of the 2 decades long expansion of the war on terror. Countries like China, for instance, and we see how in China we have the very violent and nefarious crackdown on the indigenous Uyghur Muslims in the Northwest Territory in that country. Places like Myanmar, where we witnessed over the course of the last 5 to 7 years a really violent ethnic cleansing against Rohingya Muslims in that country. All across Europe, we know what's happening in places like France. We see what's happening now in Sweden with the rise of Islamophobic populism in that country. And very intensely what's happening in India, which you all know that in 2014, the rise of the BJP and the rise of Modi found it very opportune. It was a really opportune sort of convergence that the BJP could expand its vision of Hindutva supremacy with the license of this American war on terror that criminalize and crack down on Muslim identity, especially with the convergence of the Modi regime with the rise of Trump in 2016 in the United States. The rhetoric, the vision, the law that both administrations were enacting were very much kindred. So what's happening in India, me being an American, was very much facilitated and fueled by American presidential rhetoric, policy, and perspective. So for instance, when I'm drawing some analogies to sort of highlight how American Islamophobia very much was an engine for Indian Islamophobia, that when Trump said things like Islam hates us, right, that essentially gave carte blanche to Modi and his acolytes in India to sort of crack down on the idea that Muslim identity was inimical and inassimilable with Indian identity, which you all know Indian identity from the perspective of the Hindutva vision is conflated with Hindu identity. When Trump enacts policies like the Muslim ban, that enables the Modi regime and gives again carte blanche and legitimacy for that regime to enact policies like the Citizenship Amendment Act, right? When Trump talks about the idea that the United States should enact and maintain a Muslim registry to keep tabs on where, Muslim immigrants, residents, and even citizens are traveling, where they're issuing their remittances, the way they're conducting their financial affairs, a national registry, this emboldens and authorizes Modi and the BJP to do the very same thing in your country. So it's very important. I think one of the central takeaways of my book, this book, The New Crusades, is to highlight that Islamophobia is very much a global phenomenon. We see how India has become very much an epicenter of global Islamophobia in very draconian and very distressing ways, right? With some of the policies that I've talked about, we all know about the mob violence and the vigilante violence across the country. We know how in places like in Karnataka, there's been headscarf bans that have risen all the way to the highest rungs of your judiciary, with the Supreme Court deciding whether that is constitutional or not. We even see in many respects how Indian Islamophobia is far more concerning and far more nefarious than American Islamophobia, with the assembly and the expansion of concentration camps in places like Assam, right? So for me, when I was writing this book, it's very interesting, right? Because in the United States, Islamophobia is driven by white supremacy, the idea that American identity is rooted in whiteness, and in some respects, Christianity. When I talk about Islamophobia and when I analyze it from places like France, for instance, it's driven by secularism and an idea that Europeanness, right, European, French identity, British identity is inimical to Muslim identity as sort of an uncivilized bastion or people coming from foreign lands. However, in India, it's dramatically different, right? Because the engine of Islamophobia in India, as you all know, is religion, and more pointedly, it's Hinduism and Hindutva supremacy, which is the principal ideological engine of Islamophobia in India. And what makes India, I think, even more unique to highlight how Islamophobia can become very destructive and very draconian is that India theoretically is a democracy, right? And it boasts itself to be the biggest democracy in the world. And we can see how Islamophobia in many respects can sort of eschew and erode democratic institutions in places like India. So I'm coming from the West, right? I'm writing and I'm speaking and I'm sort of functioning as an advocate on these issues from a Western nation, the United States, which thinks about democracy as being a Western sort of Christian construct. But the Indian Islamophobic example is really key because it sort of demystifies many key stereotypes about Islamophobia. Again, that it doesn't only rise from white supremacist Christian roots. And second, it can rise from Eastern democracies, which view Islam and which view Muslims as, threats to democracy, to erode and dismantle democratic institutions on the ground of Hindutva supremacy. So, so I've learned immensely from the experiences of advocates, activists, some of them who are in this room over the course of the last several years, with how Islamophobia has, been carried forward and expanded in India on the ground of, quote unquote, protecting democratic institutions, but also on ground of Hindutva supremacy. The sad reality, and I'll say this, is again, coming from the West, is not a lot of Americans, not a lot of Europeans know much about what's happening in India, right? They don't know, they haven't really wrapped their heads around how destructive, how vile Indian Islamophobia is for a range of reasons. And I'll talk about these reasons really briefly before we transition into the Q&A. One of the central reasons that I grapple with most often is when I speak to most Americans, they have sort of a fond and sterilized perspective of Hinduism. Hinduism in the West is largely viewed to be passive. It's largely viewed to be nonviolent. It's typically connected and conflated with, sort of like beloved practices like yoga, for instance, right? So most Americans cannot reconcile the idea that this is a Hindu regime that is enacting Islamophobia in very violent ways, right? The sort of sensibilities of how we think about Hinduism in the West disables most Americans and most Europeans' ability to see Hinduism devolving to what we see in India with Hindutva supremacy. That is one factor. A second factor is, many of you may know, and I echo this oftentimes on my social media platforms, is Western media outlets, typically speaking, will not shocase Muslims when Muslims are victims, right? There's little appetite. Some volume on that end. There we go. In the Western media sort of enterprise, there's little appetite to talk about and analyze the experiences of Muslims when Muslims are victims, right? However, and that's exactly what's happening in India. I think if you were to survey most Americans, many of them would not know that India is home to the second or the third biggest Muslim population in the world. And as a consequence of that, there's little appetite for American media outlets to examine and showcase the experience of Muslims when they're victims. However, Muslims are always front and center when Muslims are the culprits of some kind of violence, and when they're oftentimes playing the role of villain. So one thing that I really grapple with, not only in my book, but in my work as an advocate publicly, is to try to crises like India in the West, to talk about the fact that Islamophobia is rising societally in India, rising as a state-sponsored system and structure in India by way of law, policy, using social media, because the conventional and traditional media outlets are not talking about it. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to field any questions from the audience about Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, anything I addressed about the media here in the West, or third, more pointed questions about analogies between what's happening in the States and what's happening in India, or even more focused questions on Islamophobia as a menace in your country of India. But thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you. I wish I would have a chance to come to India, but I hear there's still an arrest warrant out for me if I ever come to the country.
Thank you, Khalid A Beydoun, for this, giving us some insights about how it's being a global phenomenon and how it's both connected. And I personally have a lot of things to say, that basically we can go with an interactive session rather than Q&A, and if in between the audience, if they have questions, they can ask. So in India, if we see there, for the individual, there is a microaggressions where we don't know how to address these microaggressions. We know about Islamophobia, how Islamophobia is working, but while coming into tackling it or addressing it, we all are facing a difficult issues. For example, micro level things. If I'm getting into an auto, I had a personal experience where when I'm getting into an auto, a person just ranted Jai Shri Ram. So Jai Shri Ram is a slogan where it is a hate mongering, which is used for lynching. For me, it is a moment where I feel like next moment I will be killed or I will be lynched but it might be proportion might be less, like it might not be happen, but for me the hate crime is happened against me, or Islamophobic act is acted against me. So there are these moments where non-criminal acts which are seen by the police, it's up to the police, it's up to the criminal justice system who decide that this harmed me, or it's rest of the police hands. So there are these non-criminal acts which may develop into a criminal offenses, and there is this that this person might be killed, or even though that's probably not going to happen, the participant or the person might feel like that the same effect of the hate crime, like I will be feeling that I was a victim of hate crime. So these everyday verbal abuses or microaggressions, it might be just staring also, that
Yep.
they had to we have to tolerate that this will happen if we are a Muslim in India, or this will happen if we are participating in a protest, that these occurrences are not significant enough to be reported to the police. So this kind of mindset is coming to us, like if one person calls Jai Shri Ram, like branded Jai Shri Ram, and I feel like it is not much to be reported, or it is not much to be noted as such because I'm a Muslim and it will happen in India. So this kind of things, like if even in the staring or in the ranting, it's just staring, like might be staring, but we can feel that it is hate. But for the rest of the people, it might not be harmed us. For the police, it doesn't harm us. So whom we will go, or how we will address this or tackle these things. Like it will be like very micro level
Yeah.
things, which will harm us a lot.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Nidit. I think that one thing that you identify is that one of the unseen or overlooked dimensions of this culture of Islamophobia is how it sort of seeds and sows this paranoia that exists in the minds of every Muslim that lives in a society where Islamophobia is present and pervasive, that we interpret anything, right? And sometimes the activity could be benign activity. I'll give you an example. It's not sort of a direct analogy with what you're talking about in India, which is far more frightening, right? Because once you hear in the slogan Jai Shri Ram is used and it's chanted by these mobs who are marching down to vandalize mosques, to place the saffron flags on mosques, to attack visible Muslims in your country. So it has a menacing tone. And I want to talk about something that happened to me on Twitter last year and a bit with regards to the slogan of Jai Shri Ram. But I'll give you an example, right? So a couple of years ago, I was at an airplane here in the United States, and my mother calls me while I'm sitting in the airplane, traveling from my home in Michigan to Washington, D.C. And I pick up the phone and I'm sitting on the airplane, and we speak Arabic at home. When I was a child, we spoke Arabic as our native language at home, not English, even though we lived in the United States. My mom calls me without even thinking. I respond to her in Arabic, sitting in the airplane where the airplane's getting ready to take off. And 3 or 4 people sitting around me began to look at me like, why is he speaking this language, this foreign language that we think in our minds is connected to terrorism, right? That is connected to the prospect of this brown individual sitting in the plane, maybe hijacking this plane as soon as it takes off, right? People were looking at me. I'm sure some of these people who were looking at me, were bigoted and had hateful sort of ideas about who I was as a brown man speaking Arabic on the phone. Some of them may not have had that bigoted perspective. They just might have been curious as to why, what language is he speaking, from a non-bigoted perspective. But that isn't the point. The point is that as a consequence of living in a country where Islamophobia is pervasive, the United States in my instance, and India in your example, is that we're conditioned as Muslims to interpreting and perceiving anything and everything coming our way as being bigoted, or in your instance, like the example you've given, as in the possibility of an imminent violent attack, right? Because there's precedent for it. And the reason in this paranoia that we're feeling is by no means irrational. It is rational, right? Because we read news stories, we see tweets, we hear stories from friends and family members, right, who are attacked when somebody yells Jai Shri Ram, right? Who are attacked when somebody in the United States marches down with a Confederate flag or chants some white supremacist slogan. There's precedents, there's stories, there's examples of young women having their hijab torn off, young Muslim men with beards or thobes being beaten. And in your country, there's story after story, oftentimes stories that are never reported, where people are being beaten, killed, mosques are being vandalized, homes are being bulldozed, while men are chanting Jai Shri Ram. So that is the analysis is the easy part, right? The hard part is the latter question you posed is, what can you do? It's difficult in India because oftentimes the police are acting in cahoots and in conspiracy with these Hindutva mobs and these Hindutva thugs, right? Oftentimes these policemen are people you cannot go to because they feel the same way as the the thugs and the terrorists that are attacking and violating Muslim women. So that is what's really frightening about Islamophobia in India, is that it's not only rising from society, but in many states and cities across your country, the politicians, the elected officials, and the police are very much acting in conspiracy with the societal Hindutva terrorists.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is not also termed as criminal act, or this is not, each of this is not right as like this is crime in India. So basically in India, we doesn't have a specific hate crime law also, and it doesn't recognize hate crimes as a specific category of offense. It was like the National Crime Records of Bureau of India is the one federal organization that tracks all the crimes, nationwide crimes. Okay, so after 2017 also they stopped keeping a record of hate crimes such as lynching, cow vigilantism, and mob violence and all. So the absence of this specific hate crime law and the reliance on the existing provisions, there are some existing provisions like sections which is religious hatred or passing enmity between religious, such laws rather than hate crimes. And this have been also criticized for not providing an adequate protection for the victims of the hate crime or the Islamophobia, and for failing to address the specific nature and impact of the violence, because Islamophobic violence is not just as sexual violence. If a Muslim woman is victim of sexual violence, it might not be just sexual violence, it will be the because of her religion also, which is Muslim. So how do you see the act of violence which occurred against Muslims or a group of Muslims, which remains unrecognized as a hate crime or Islamophobia in the judicial process? Because while also coming with the hate crime law in India, if you are asking for a hate crime law to be implemented in India also, is we feel like this is knife against us itself, because who is implementing the policies, who is implementing the law, that comes the question. So how much is this hate crime or hate crime law, if you are having a movement for Islamophobia, like an Islamophobic act to be implemented and Islamophobic act to be implemented in India, how much is the possibility of it, or what will be the consequences in India if you are providing that hate crime to be? Because if it's for our safety, we are asking for a hate crime law, but in Indian situation, we are in a position where we feel like the laws which we itself asking will be a knife against us.
Yeah, and we've had similar issues here with the classification and qualification of hate crimes in the United States. Oftentimes, for it to qualify as a hate crime in the United States, you need the commission of some sort of violent act, and you have to establish that the intent of hate was manifested by the violent act. What makes it really difficult in your instance is, slogans like Jai Shri Ram are oftentimes disqualified by Hindutva supremacists and sympathizers as not being an expression of hate, but a religious expression that is not intentionally targeted or chanted to fuel or drive some sort of Islamophobic act. But let me say this. So I think your question speaks to the idea as to how can we sort of mobilize, galvanize, and expand a movement for Islamophobia in India if we're crippled or disabled by the fact that hate crimes qualification in the country is oppositional or not enabling us to qualify our, attacks on Muslims as full-fledged or bona fide hate crimes. I'll say this, is that in your instance, in the American instance when Trump was in power, is the movement for Islamophobia was viewed as oppositional to the state, right? That we did not need any kind of state acknowledgement or state legitimacy to carry forward a grassroots movement again for Islamophobia, right? I'll give you another example. So here in the United States, Trump, signs the Muslim ban, enacts it into policy. The Supreme Court, the highest court in this land, I'm a law professor, right? I teach law. The Supreme Court of this country held that the Muslim ban was constitutional. It held that it was possible, not only possible, but it was constitutional and legal for this country to deny immigrants on grounds of religious identity from coming into the country. So I say this to say that whenever you're launching a grassroots movement against a regime, you have to be very clairvoyant and accept the idea that the state, every state apparatus when that regime is in power, is being used by the regime to suppress, to stifle, and suffocate you, right? So the fact that hate crimes are being framed in a way that are, oppositional to the way we want them to be framed, that is to be expected. It's unsurprising because the regime is defining what qualify as hate crimes in ways that expand, in this country's instance, white supremacy, and in your country's instance, Hindutva supremacy, right? So we can't expect during this regime where the BJP are in power that they're going to frame hate crimes in a way that are amenable to Indian Muslims, which makes our responsibility to have a more robust, clear, effective grassroots movement.
As you said that, like, the judiciary also has the power, the language they use, as you said, in the US itself, in America itself, like the language they use also have a lot of things to do. Recently, today Supreme Court in India, Supreme Court of India directs all states to register suo motu FIR against hate speech. And with that, they also added that irrespective of Hindu or Muslim. So you can, against hate, FIR can be charged against hate speech, but it also irrespective of, they have added it, irrespective of Hindu or Muslim, which also gives the language they build. So there is a power of judiciary. It's not just based on the judiciary have a power to ability to enforce the law through the physical force, but also it's have the ability to use their language to create a meaning and establish the legitimacy of its authority. So there are some other verdicts, we cannot stop demolitions. When the demolitions were happening, it says that we cannot stop demolition. And it's another one of the top courts order was a mosque was not essential to Muslim mode of worship. And in the Karnataka High Court verdict also, it was said that hijab is not essential. So I also feels like the judiciary, the Supreme Court's verdict, the language they use also have a lot of things to do in the society, because it in a way give the society a view that it is through this power of language that the judiciary is able to exert its authority, and the society will perceive how the judiciary put forward. I think there are some hand raised. So this language always creates an injury in Muslims and also into the other people, where people will perceive like the judiciary, the power position, people in the power position are saying like this, it's not essential for Muslims. The person in the power position is saying that this can be done, we can't do anything, which is in a way enabling the institutionalized Islamophobia also in the country.
Yeah, very much so, right? And I think that I'll just make a brief remark to that, Nidha, is, India claims to be a democracy, right? One of the foundations and cornerstone of any democracy, whether it be India, the United States, France, whatever nation claims to be a democracy, an anchor of democracy is free expression. And what emanates from free expression is the free exercise of religion. So, the High Court of Karnataka saying that hijab is not essential, that's not for them to decide in a democracy. In a democracy where liberty should exist, and flourish, the individual, right, should decide whether the hijab is essential. The Muslim women should decide whether wearing a hijab is essential to her spiritual identity or not the state. So what's really ironic and what's really useful for us as advocates against Islamophobia in democratic countries is to say that democratic for who, right? It's not democratic for Muslims, and specifically Muslim women who cannot exercise their free exercise of religion rights in ways that align with their spiritual perspective.
Yeah, that's it. That this all narrative by the judiciary is always giving an outer narrative to the society that this can be done because the person in the power is using this. So while they are saying that excuses, while they uses the words like terrorist or extremists, or for the collective consciousness, we are hanging this person or whatever it is, it's actually giving a perspective to the outside the world or to the society that this can be done to the Muslims. So this is the value. And then sometimes the perpetrators are described in a way that minimize or excuses their actions. This can also contribute to a culture of impunity that allows anti-Muslim violences or Islamophobic violence to continue. So how they describe a perpetrator, how they describe a victim is also very important. So the language, the power, the people in power gives a lot of impact into the society also. There are two hands raised. Muhammad Alfoz.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
you
we
are.
can hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Khalid, for speaking on this very important topic. So, as far I understood from the opening remarks of this particular lecture, you were speaking mostly on methodological approaches, and uh, with the help of dichotomy which we have created between global Islamophobia and how it has different from Indian perspective. So, first of all, pardon me that I am attending this program without reading your whole book. Though I have read the third chapter of your book, which is basically based on Indian experience. So I just want to dish out a few remarks before putting my forward my main question. So as far I understood, after listening to your opening remarks and after going through a few pages of your book, uh, what I think that Islamophobia, it has Islamophobia studies itself, it has carved its own genre, and it constitutes some sort of paradigm, So and also it resonate with Thomas Kuhn description of paradigm, if I put in exact word, so Thomas Kuhn, the concept of paradigm by Thomas Kuhn, if we relate those paradigms. So I'm relating the Islamophobic studies with Thomas Kuhn paradigm. So basically, broadly, as far I understood, the Islamophobia studies based on primarily four sort of paradigms. First is symbolic generalization, which includes, the Islamophobia studies provide some sort of theories which relate to the problematization of Muslimness, right? And second paradigm, that it has some sort of metaphysical presumptions, where Islamophobia is understood as the marginalization of Muslims, And third paradigm is related to values, where Islamophobia studies, are accurate in predicting any assault as Islamophobia. So by considering these three broad paradigms, the question uh, which I got in my mind right after listening to your opening remarks and relating it with the Thomas Kuhn paradigm is I related with the studies of race. Before especially before the 1980s, the racism covered used to cover the problematization of Muslimness. So the basic question after seeing all these paradigm issues, how can Islamophobia be a type of racism and simultaneously be understood as a different paradigm? And also this discussion, is commonly presented as how can Muslim being from diverse ethnic background be considered a race? So before 1980s, we have seen that theories of race have been covering all these things. So how you will create a dichotomy between the racial studies and Islamophobic studies more in a methodological approach? Thank you so much.
Yeah, let me see if I can field sort of the two primary threats from that question. And thank you so much for that question in the remarks mode. So how can Islamophobia be framed as a mode of racism when it is in fact a religion and not a race that we're talking about? That is a great question, and a question that I encounter quite often. And then the second sort of like thread of your presentation is how does Islamophobia pose a distinct kind of political or epistemological paradigm for Western countries, but in some respects, non-Western countries like India, and I can address that after I address the first. But and correct me if I'm sort of like distorting or disfiguring the essence of your question. The first question is, even though Islam is a religion and practitioners of the religion of Islam, Muslims are individuals of a wide, eclectic, globally diverse and disparate population of people, is the fact that over centuries, largely as a consequence of first Orientalism and then modern sort of iterations of Orientalism, is that Islam has been deeply racialized, right? Especially in places like the United States, where Islam has been racialized, generally speaking, as a brown, Middle Eastern, foreign religion that has been packaged and peddled by the government and media outlets through these really neat and recycled caricatures of what Muslims look like, right? And that obviously took on, very intense, potent, and visible form during the post 9/11 context and the broader war on terror, that all Muslims wear turbans, all Muslims are brown-skinned, all Muslim men have beards, right? And all Muslim women wear hijab or niqab, right? There was a deep sort of public and optical racialization of Muslims that, sat alongside how Muslims were envisioned as a religious community, right? And obviously in this racialization of Muslims that became very potent and powerful during the war on terror, sort of distorted the idea that Islam was a bona fide and standalone and distinct religion. And oftentimes these hate crimes, right? When Nida talks about hate crimes in India and hate crimes in the United States that are Islamophobic in nature, they're not always fueled by religious bigotry or religious animus, but oftentimes racialized animus. That is why when I talk about in my work, in my study, how private Islamophobia is distinct from structural Islamophobia or institutionalized Islamophobia, in the minds of most hate mongers, bigots, specifically in the United States, right, or in the West, where there's less sort of familiarity with who Muslims are and what Muslims look like versus a place like India or Muslim majority countries, Pakistan, places like that, where there's a deeper and more intimate understanding by non-Muslims as to who Muslims are and what do Muslims look like. Private Islamophobia in the United States is driven by racism and a racialized understandings of who Muslims might be. That is why in the United States, for instance, oftentimes the victims of private Islamophobic violence are not Muslims. They sometimes are Sikh men, because Sikh men kind of fit this imagined caricature for what Muslims look like in the minds of many ignorant private Islamophobes. So it can be racism, it can be racial violence. I can talk a lot more about that, but I want to segue into the next question because of time also. So many of you might have heard about this book that was written in, I believe was published in the late 90s by a Harvard professor by the name of Samuel Huntington, right? The book was called The Clash of Civilizations, right? The idea that the West and Western democracies and allies of Western democracies, beyond Europe and beyond North America, were on the cusp of engaging in a full-fledged transnational civilizational war with Islam. Islam was this rival civilization, right, that was threatening the stability, the sanctity, and the identity of Western democracies in ways that would sort of threaten the existence of these Western democracies, right? That Islam was coming not only to terrorize the United States, Europe, India, and so forth and so on, but their objective was to take it over, right? Muslims did not want to just live and be citizens in these places. Their objective was a full-fledged takeover. co-option of these countries in total. So this is the civilizational paradigm, or the, like you talk about, the sort of like new paradigm that is being adopted by Islamophobes, that there's a civilizational threat coming from Muslims, whether they be immigrant Muslims coming to places like the United States or Europe, or indigenous Muslims in the instance of India, where their objective isn't just to simply thrive, flourish, take care of their families, go to college, go to school, open up businesses, and live alongside and side by side their Hindu, Christian, Sikh, Jain, secular, agnostic, atheist classmates, colleagues, and neighbors. They didn't want to simply coexist, but this paradigm professed, and it's more than just professing, it's a calculated sort of fear mongering to say that no, the Muslim objective in design is far more nefarious. Their objective is to take over these countries. That is what drives Islamophobia beyond just this minimal threat of terrorism, right? Even though when the war on terror is gone, and the idea that Muslims sort of manifest this threat of terrorism, there's something far more concerning for us as Muslims that we have to be focused on, which is the idea that Islamophobia and Islamophobes are peddling this idea far beyond this threat of terrorism, that it is our objective to take over these countries. And when they peddle this idea on media outlets, in legislatures, and in courts that Muslims want to take over, that enables them, that legitimizes the kind of structural, institutionalized Islamophobic policy that we see being enacted across the United States, in Europe, and also in India. The idea that you can pass a headscarf ban in a democratic country is based on this fear, this new paradigmatic sort of fear-mongering that Muslims are plotting and conspiring to take over these countries. And this idea comes from a book that is written by, again, Samuel Huntington, which is still very prominent and influential, called The Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have another question sent by Manshid. So thank you for the insightful lecture, Professor Khalid Beydoun. So the question is, even if we can say that Indian political regimes and society is beneficiary of global phenomenon of Islamophobia, which has its roots in, as you said, in global war on terror, don't you think that Indian version of Islamophobia should be addressed or understood with its distinctness from the Western form of Islamophobia manifestations? Because I think on the one hand, the category of Islamophobia is an alien one for India, and on the other, it is really important to understand how Islamophobia is working in the particular context like India to tackle it. In some, since there are considerable differences with Indian social history from other situations where the category of Islamophobia originated as part of the political struggle, do you think that category of Islamophobia needs to be reconfigured by grounding in the particular situation of India without draining its global implication? Isn't this grounded scholarship is necessary to develop legal or political means to tackle Islamophobia as we did in the case of caste atrocities in India? It's said as a little question, but it's a very big question.
Yeah, and I definitely echo the sentiment of that question. I by no means, I'm not an expert on Indian history, Indian politics, Indian law, and let me circle back to the sort of essence of this question and talk about the work that I do, right? So my audiences are primarily American and Western, right? Specifically my academic audiences, and my media and social media audiences are largely Western. And one thing I've really struggled with over the course of the last nine to 10 years is I've learned about what's happening in India since the inception of the Modi regime in 2014, as best I could as an individual, as best I can as an academic. And one thing I've really struggled with is impressing upon my audiences, which are generally American audiences, as to how menacing and why we should be concerned with Islamophobia in India. But let me tell you, Americans are a lot dumber than Indians, right? You guys are a lot more intelligent than the average American. And I say that honestly, right? That in order for Americans to care about anything, sad to say, you have to connect it to their experience, right? So for me, the fact that I talk about Indian Islamophobia connected to the American War on Terror in part is strategic, because one way I can make Americans care about what is happening in India and want to learn about and then act on what's happening with Islamophobia in India is to connect it to what's happening in the United States. So that's a reason why I'm tying Indian Islamophobia to what's happening in the United States on one level. The second level is, let's be frank, right? And I think that, whether you want to sort of dissect and analyze Indian Islamophobia as a standalone and independent sort of entity, definitely, encourage academics and scholars in that country to do so. And many of them have done so, right? And I've learned from them immensely in their studies. But we can't overlook the role that the American War on Terror has had on expanding and enabling Indian Islamophobia to rise, right? So whether it's, again, this law and logic and lexicon of tying terrorism and counterterrorism to Muslim identity, when it's coming from the United States, right? This is the global superpower, the global hegemon, which is rubber stamping the idea that any expressions of Muslim identity, specifically, visible and religious expressions of Muslim identity, are tied to a propensity for terrorism, right? And I talk about dialectical Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a dialectic. This message coming from American law and political rhetoric is essentially emboldening and authorizing Indian politicians to do the same and to pass laws and to pass policy in India. So you can't entirely disconnect what's happening in India from what's happening on a global level, specifically coming from the United States, because we're talking about the global superpower, and we live in a more globalized world than we've ever lived before. But circling back to the essence of the question, definitely, I think that there are really important, really compelling distinctions, right, with Indian Islamophobia that require a focused, isolated, and very robust treatment of Indian Islamophobia from an intrinsic standpoint that renders secondary what's happening on a global level. I am not the individual that can do that because I am not an expert on Indian law, history, and politics.
Thank you for that. I think there is no more questions.
That was the end. That was the conclusion of the questions.
Let me see. We can wait for a few more minutes.
Sure.
If someone is raising their hands, we can see. Meanwhile, I would like to know why the name, The New Crusades, for the book. The New Crusades.
Yeah, so the title behind the book was inspired by two things. First, when President George Bush announced the global war on terror, he announced it and he titled it as a global crusade on terrorism. And he did that intentionally because many of you may know that the term the Crusades has very long-standing and pointedly religious connotation, right? The idea that these, very ancient old wars in Europe between Christian factions and Islam, that we all know as the original Crusades, was being hearkened to by President Bush, and not only President Bush, but Obama, and then more explicitly Trump, as civilizational crusades. So the title of the book being called The New Crusades is to sort of do two things: be provocative, and then second, take back the definition of the Crusades to title these Islamophobic crackdowns on Muslim populations around the world as nefarious forms of new crusades on Muslim peoples.
Let's go. I think we have no more questions because someone is raising their hands. If you have some concluding remarks or something to us, how to move forward in this very Islamophobic country, how we should move forward and how we can tackle this in a very little level, in a small level we can, as an individual and as a movement also. Fraternity movement is a movement is fighting against Islamophobia in all the level and so if you have some comments or if you have some suggestions how to move forward and please.
No, yeah, I think so. Above all, thank you for, hosting and having me for this event. It's always, a privilege, and I always learn immensely from the experiences of, Muslims from around the world, whether it be, I'm going to Europe in the coming weeks to do some book tours there, whether it be speaking to audiences in, countries around the world and now in India. It's always, instructive and beneficial to me to hear your perspectives, and many of the perspectives in the book, come from real individuals who experience Islamophobia. I think one piece of advice or guidance that I'd give is we're all citizens of distinct countries, right? I'm a citizen of the United States. You all are citizens of India. We're living at a moment where the world is more globalized than ever, where transnational connections are tighter, more sort of connected than ever, whether it be through social media, virtual media. Technology has enabled us to be connected in ways that are unprecedented, is to really capitalize on these new transnational unions between us so we can learn from one another and link our movements together. So even though there's a separate movement against Islamophobia in India, and we have a movement here in the United States, is to really, capitalize on the bridges and the bonds that we have between these movements, because the governments work together, right? Trump, you all know, came to India and met with Modi, and these governments that are keen on expanding Islamophobia work together. So it's really important for us as movements, but also as Muslims, to be bonded and to work in unison against these Islamophobic fronts in ways that consolidate our movements.